At 8:14 on the morning of September 18, 1944, the streets of Arnhem were a hellish landscape of fire, smoke, and destruction. Rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the rubble-strewn cobblestones, turning the city into a slippery battlefield. Men of the 2nd Parachute Battalion huddled behind broken walls, gripping their rifles and whispering desperate prayers. Fear was thick, almost visible in the foggy air. Amid the chaos, one figure moved differently. Major Digby Tatum Wart stood in the open street, utterly calm and not a gun in sight. In his hands was a simple cane umbrella, black silk stretched over a slender wooden frame. His men stared at him in disbelief. It was absurd. It was preposterous. And yet, in that absurdity lay a quiet defiance. 60 yards away, a German armored vehicle rumbled around the corner. Its turret turned smoothly, scanning for targets, machine guns aimed and ready. Its armor gleamed wetly in the rain, mocking the rifles and machine guns pointed at it. Every man in Digby's platoon froze, knowing that any attack would be suicide. They were trapped, outnumbered, and facing a weapon designed to crush them like insects. But Digby didn't flinch. He didn't call for reinforcements. He simply opened his umbrella, lifted it against the rain, and began walking toward the tank. His officers had mocked him for carrying it. Chaplains had questioned his sanity. Yet, in that moment, the men realized something remarkable. This was not foolishness. It was courage, raw and unapologetic. To understand why an officer would bring an umbrella into battle, you had to understand the man. Born in 1917 and educated at Sandhurst, Digby was brilliant but plagued by one peculiar problem. He could not remember passwords. In airborne operations, forgetting a challenge code could mean instant execution by your own troops. Digby needed an identifier that was unmistakably British, instantly recognizable, and, most importantly, impossible to forget. The solution he found was simple, elegant, and utterly unconventional: a 14-ounce cane umbrella with a curved handle and a black silk canopy. When other officers loaded up with 65 pounds of combat gear, Digby packed lightly, a bowler hat and his umbrella. His comrades laughed at the sight. One lieutenant quipped, "Planning to have tea with the Germans, sir?" Even the battalion commander raised an eyebrow, but Digby only smiled politely. "My goodness, sir," he said. "What if it rains?" 4 weeks leading up to the invasion, the umbrella was the object of ridicule. Soldiers called him the dandy of the airborne and the fool with a toy. Yet Digby understood something they did not. War strips away rank, shreds protocol, and turns chaos into law. In the storm of falling mortars and whistling bullets, men do not follow officers, they follow symbols. And the umbrella was his symbol, a beacon of composure in the eye of the storm. On September 17th, the laughter ended. Operation Market Garden was underway, a bold gamble by Field Marshal Montgomery to end the war by Christmas. 35,000 paratroopers would drop behind enemy lines, capture bridges, and pave the way for armored units to march into Germany. Digby's company, the tip of the spear, faced the hardest mission: seize the road bridge at Arnhem. Intelligence reports had painted a rosy picture: old men and boys guarding the town, retreating panzer divisions. Reality was far grimmer. Hidden in the forests and behind camouflaged nets were the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, battle-hardened veterans from the Russian front. Tanks, half-tracks, and machine guns waited where Digby was about to land. At 1,400 hours, green lights flashed in the transport plane. Digby adjusted his bowler hat, hooked his umbrella on his arm, and stepped into the void. The parachute drop was eerily peaceful, almost serene. While others struggled with tangled chutes, Digby landed gracefully, rose to his feet, and unfurled his umbrella. It was not merely a shield against the rain, it was a tool, a pointer, a signal to his men. The soldiers of the 2nd Battalion watched, incredulous. Their major was calm in a storm of bullets and fire, walking confidently with an umbrella as if promenading through Hyde Park. The tension eased. If he could remain composed in the chaos of airborne warfare, perhaps they could survive too. By mid-afternoon, the radios failed. The dense Dutch forests cut off communications. Digby's company was effectively blind. Yet, even without orders from high command, he led his men off the main road, through gardens and alleyways, turning urban warfare into a tactical advantage. When a German machine gun erupted from a second-story window, Digby walked forward, umbrella raised like a sword. "Don't worry about the bullets," he called over the roar. "They've got no rhythm." It was madness. It was genius. It was the beginning of a legend. The umbrella was no longer a punchline, it was a lifeline, a symbol of hope and a challenge to the enemy. No matter how dangerous the storm, Major Digby Tatum Wart would not bow. By nightfall, Digby's men had fought through 3 enemy lines closing in on the bridge. The sky darkened, and the distant growl of tanks warned them of the horrors yet to come. But one truth had already cemented itself in every soldier's heart. The man with the umbrella was not only fearless, he was unstoppable. And so, in the ruins of Arnhem, beneath a sky of rain and smoke, a legend was born. The legend of a British officer who refused to surrender, who walked toward death with an umbrella, and who would, in time, teach the world that courage is measured not in the size of your weapon, but in the size of your spirit. The sun had barely begun to rise over the flat Dutch countryside when the first echoes of chaos shook the 2nd Parachute Battalion. Digby Tatum Wart's company had touched down miles from the bridge they were supposed to secure, scattered across fields and ditches like spilled grain. Parachutes tangled in trees, boots filled with mud, and men shouted orders that no one could hear. Rain soaked through their uniforms, mixing with sweat and blood, creating a thin layer of grime that made every movement sticky and exhausting. Amid this confusion, Digby moved with deliberate calm. While others cursed their landings or struggled to untangle harnesses, he walked upright, bowler hat slightly askew, umbrella hooked over his arm. His men began to take notice. Where others panicked, he observed. Where others ducked behind cover, he stepped forward. The absurdity of his presence, carrying a black silk canopy into a battlefield alive with bullets and shellfire, inspired a strange courage. The forests and hedgerows that led to Arnhem were crawling with danger. Reconnaissance reports had promised little resistance, yet every turn revealed more than intelligence could account for. Sniper fire whistled between the trees. Hidden machine gun nests peppered the landscape. Digby assessed each threat with the eye of a chess master. His umbrella, now more than a symbol, became an extension of his tactical awareness. He pointed toward enemy positions, signaling flanking routes, drawing invisible lines in the mud that the men could follow. By mid-afternoon, the first real clash occurred. A German reconnaissance jeep squadron barreled down the main road, expecting a clear path to the bridge. Minutes later, the sharp cracks of automatic fire tore through the air. The jeeps had driven into a trap, ambushed by the SS. Digby's men flinched, pinned to the ground as bullets shredded the hedgerows. For most, the situation was hopeless. But Digby remained composed, moving with calm precision, directing his men to take alternate routes through the gardens and backyards of Dutch homes. Each movement was choreographed, each order clear. In that chaos, he was the only certainty. The streets of Arnhem itself were no refuge. As the British approached the first row of houses, mortar shells screamed overhead, exploding with deafening fury. Windows shattered. Roof tiles fell like rain. The men pressed against walls, unsure whether to move forward or retreat. Digby, however, strode through the rubble. The umbrella was raised above his head, shielding him from debris and rain alike. When a machine gun erupted from a second-story window, he did not duck. He advanced, pointing the umbrella at the gunner as if it were a rapier. "Don't worry about it," he shouted. "They've got no rhythm." The effect on the soldiers was immediate. Where terror had held them frozen, a flicker of audacity took root. They followed him through alleys, around overturned carts, into the gardens of civilian houses. With each step, Digby's presence instilled a blend of awe and determination. He wasn't simply leading, he was rewriting the rules of engagement. These weren't men obeying an officer, they were rallying behind a figure who seemed untouchable, immune to fear, and entirely unpredictable. Even the Germans began to notice. Snipers who had expected easy kills found their targets vanishing behind hedges and reappearing in impossible positions. Machine gun teams were outflanked by soldiers who seemed to appear from nowhere, guided by the uncanny calm of the man with the umbrella. By the time the British reached the edge of the town, several German positions had been neutralized without the battalion losing a single man to direct fire, a remarkable feat considering the overwhelming odds. Yet the danger only increased. By evening, Digby's company was cut off from the rest of the battalion. Radios had failed, likely jammed by the dense forests and the chaos of battle. The northern approach to the bridge, their ultimate goal, was heavily fortified. German half-tracks and armored vehicles lurked behind every corner. The men were exhausted, low on ammunition, and running on sheer adrenaline. Hunger and cold gnawed at them. Every step forward felt like a gamble with death. But Digby never wavered. He moved through the streets like a conductor, orchestrating attacks, flanking maneuvers, and cover positions with a grace that bordered on surreal. He would walk into an exposed street, umbrella raised, signaling the men to follow him. Bullets would whistle past, shells would explode nearby, yet he remained untouched, a beacon of focus and control. The juxtaposition of his calm demeanor and the violence surrounding him became almost theatrical, like a master painter stepping onto a battlefield to sketch the chaos. By the time darkness fell, Digby's company had made significant gains. 3 German blocking positions had been bypassed or neutralized. The streets were still hostile, yet the men felt a shift within themselves. Where fear had dominated before, a new confidence emerged. Their leader, absurd as he seemed to anyone outside this nightmare, had proven that audacity and cleverness could trump overwhelming firepower. Nightfall brought little comfort. The streets of Arnhem were smoldering, the air thick with smoke and the smell of wet gunpowder. But Digby remained a figure of composure. In the dim light, the black silk of his umbrella glistened wetly, a surreal flag amidst the ruin. For the soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, it became more than a piece of fabric on a stick. It was a lifeline, a morale anchor in the chaos, and a promise that survival was still possible, even in the heart of enemy territory. As the men hunkered down in gardens and broken houses for the night, one thought lingered in every mind. If the man with the umbrella could face this storm without hesitation, maybe, just maybe, they could survive it too. And in the back of Digby's mind, he knew the real test had yet to come. The tanks were coming. The SS Panzer divisions were massing. And soon, he would face a challenge that no soldier had ever imagined. And he would meet it, as always, with the calmest of smiles and the black silk of his umbrella in hand. Dawn broke over Arnhem on September 18, 1944, but it brought no peace, only the relentless pounding of mortar shells and the metallic growl of German armor. The streets were slick with rain, debris, and the lingering scent of smoke from the previous day's fighting. For the British paratroopers, the situation had escalated from perilous to nearly hopeless. Surrounded by enemy forces, low on ammunition and cut off from command, the men could feel despair pressing against them like the cold, wet cobblestones beneath their boots. Yet, in the center of this chaos, Major Digby Tatum Wart remained an anomaly of calm. The umbrella was in his hand, bowler hat tilted just so, as he assessed the battlefield with an almost surgical precision. From his position in the doorway of a ruined townhouse, he watched a German armored car turn the corner. Its machine guns swiveled with lethal intent, scanning for targets, while its thick armor glinted ominously in the dim light. Any ordinary officer would have ducked for cover. Digby simply tilted his umbrella and began walking. The men froze, gripping their weapons. They had no anti-tank guns, no heavy artillery, nothing capable of stopping the metal beast that now lumbered toward them. Fear rippled through the platoon. Yet when Digby moved, it wasn't panic, it was purpose. His steps were deliberate, measured, almost rhythmic. In that instant, it became clear to every soldier around him. This man did not merely accept danger. He challenged it. The armored car was closing fast. Its engine roared like a trapped predator, and the machine gunner's barrel traced the street ahead, ready to cut down anyone foolish enough to be caught in its path. Digby waited. The rain-slicked cobblestones reflected the vehicle's headlights, shimmering like molten metal. With less than 10 yards between him and the tank, he launched himself forward, not away from danger but alongside it. The driver, focused on the road, did not see the British officer moving in the blind spot. In 3 measured strides, Digby reached the vehicle, climbed the fender with the agility of a trained athlete, and positioned the tip of his umbrella against the driver's viewport. With a single, precise thrust, the steel tip jammed into the narrow slit. Inside, chaos erupted. The driver slammed on the brakes, wrenching the steering wheel violently, causing the vehicle to skid into a wall with a grinding crash. The turret spun uselessly. From the street below, Digby leaped to safety, landing as gracefully as a dancer. His men stared in disbelief, some laughing, some silent, all inspired. A Pat anti-tank team, waiting in a second-story window, fired a hollow charge round into the immobilized armored car. The shot cracked the armor and silenced the turret. Digby bent to check the umbrella, silk intact, tip slightly bent, and quipped, "Useful things, umbrellas. Keeps the sun out of your eyes." The absurdity of the act was lost on no one. The men, hardened by combat, cheered quietly, their morale lifted in a way bullets could never achieve. The umbrella had become more than a symbol, it was a psychological weapon. Every German soldier watching from a distance, even those too far to see the details, sensed an unusual confidence radiating from this single officer. It was unnerving, destabilizing, almost magical. Yet there was no time for celebration. The disabled armored car was only the lead of the column. Behind it, a wave of armored vehicles, half-tracks, and infantry advanced relentlessly. The Germans had learned that the British would not retreat easily. They brought their heaviest metal forward, intending to crush the defenders and leave nothing standing. But Digby's mind raced faster than the enemy engines. He assessed the terrain: narrow streets, obstructed sightlines, and blind spots inherent to armored vehicles. Every element of the urban battlefield was now a potential advantage. He rallied his men. "Hold your positions, lads," he shouted over the roar. "Let them come closer. Close enough that their armor becomes a cage." The soldiers understood. They were no longer passive. They were participants in a plan that defied conventional tactics. They would use the enemy's confidence, their size, and their restricted vision against them. Digby moved from window to window, coordinating flanking teams, guiding riflemen, and positioning grenadiers. The umbrella, held lightly in one hand, became the command baton of an orchestra composed of chaos and steel. The first half-track of the next wave entered the trap. Digby timed his actions perfectly. He darted into the street, umbrella raised, then vaulted onto the fender, repeating the precise motion he had used moments before. Inside, the crew panicked. They slammed the brakes and spun the vehicle sideways into debris, immobilizing it just long enough for the British sharpshooters to eliminate the threat. Within minutes, a column that should have overrun the platoon lay scattered, immobilized, and stunned. For the men witnessing it, the impossible had become reality. A 14-ounce umbrella, a bowler-hatted officer, and a calm mind had neutralized an armored division's advance, not through brute force but through audacity, timing, and understanding of human and mechanical limitations. The absurd had become legendary. And yet, Digby knew the battle was far from over. The panzer divisions were still massing. The SS would regroup, reinforce, and attack with even greater ferocity. But one thing was undeniable: the morale of the 2nd Battalion had shifted. Where fear had dominated, courage now reigned. The legend of the umbrella had begun. As the rain continued to fall on the shattered streets, Digby adjusted his hat, checked his umbrella, and moved forward. The German forces had been momentarily stunned. The British were alive, inspired, and ready. And at the center of it all, the man with the umbrella proved a singular truth. Sometimes the most improbable weapon can become the most effective one in the hands of the resolute, the fearless, and the utterly unorthodox. By late morning on September 18th, the streets of Arnhem had transformed into a war zone unlike any the 2nd Parachute Battalion had encountered. The houses lining the cobbled roads were blackened with smoke, windows shattered, and roofs punctured by shells. Mortar fire had turned entire blocks into rubble fields, littered with broken timber, bricks, and the remnants of lives once lived there. The British paratroopers had held firm, but their strength was waning. Supplies were critically low, ammunition scarce, water nearly gone, and food non-existent. Yet in the midst of this chaos, Major Digby Tatum Wart moved with the poise of a man entirely untouched by fear. The umbrella, damp from relentless rain, rested lightly in his hand, a surreal counterpoint to the destruction around him. While men crouched behind walls, shaking with exhaustion and terror, Digby would stroll along the streets, inspecting positions, encouraging the wounded, and reinforcing morale with calm words or subtle humor. Whenever a mortar shell screamed overhead and exploded with deafening intensity, sending fragments of brick and stone ricocheting, he would pop the umbrella open and murmur to the nearby soldiers, "Don't worry, chaps. I've got it covered." The absurdity was not lost on anyone, yet somehow it worked. In the fog of relentless bombardment, laughter, even quiet laughter, became a shield against despair. The men clung to the symbol of their fearless officer as if it were a lifeline, a proof that survival was possible even when the world had gone mad. The Germans, of course, noticed the figure with the umbrella. They had grown accustomed to facing paratroopers dug into cover, rifles poised, and mortars at the ready. This officer, however, seemed to move without fear, stepping into the open, drawing attention to himself, yet remaining unscathed. His behavior was unnerving. A commander who refuses to hide disrupts the enemy's calculations, forces hesitation, and sows confusion. Digby understood this implicitly. He was no longer just a leader, he was a psychological weapon. By afternoon, the Germans changed tactics. Realizing that conventional infantry assaults could not break the British defenses, they concentrated their armored forces. Tiger tanks, armored half-tracks, and flamethrower-equipped vehicles moved into position, seeking to burn the paratroopers out of their makeshift positions. The streets became a gauntlet of fire and steel. Every house was a potential death trap. Every doorway a target for destruction. Even under these conditions, Digby remained resolute. When a house defending a critical section of the northern approach came under intense fire, he did not retreat. He stepped into the open, umbrella raised, signaling his men to flank the enemy. Bayonets affixed, rifles at the ready, the soldiers surged forward under his lead. What followed was a chaotic ballet of close-quarters combat. Fists, helmets, rifle butts, knives and sheer determination clashing against disciplined SS forces. Against all odds, the British retook the garden and secured the house. As the sun began to set, the full gravity of the situation became clear. The battalion was isolated, encircled by German forces and rapidly running out of options. The bridge, once the objective, was now a beacon of death, flanked by machine guns and reinforced positions. Many of the soldiers had not slept in days. Hunger gnawed at their bellies and thirst parched their throats. The rain provided no comfort, it only soaked their clothing, weighed down their uniforms and chilled their bones. Yet Digby persisted, inspecting positions, coordinating defenses and providing reassurance. Even the battalion chaplain, Father Egan, recognized the impact of Digby's presence. During a particularly fierce barrage, he watched the major stand in a doorway, umbrella open above his head as debris ricocheted around him. "Major," the priest shouted over the roar of artillery, "that thing won't protect you from shells." Digby looked at the umbrella then smiled warmly. "Perhaps not, Father," he replied, "but it keeps the spirits dry." The comment, absurd yet oddly comforting, lifted the men's morale just enough to sustain them through another hour of relentless bombardment. As night approached, Digby knew the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Ammunition was almost depleted, the wounded were trapped in collapsed buildings, and German forces had perfected a tactic of encircling and isolating each defensive position. Every house under British control was vulnerable to flamethrowers or incendiary shells. The streets themselves became death traps as armored vehicles rolled forward, crushing debris and firing relentlessly. Yet he refused to yield. Even as exhaustion threatened to consume the men, Digby coordinated evacuations of the wounded, moving them from burning buildings to slightly safer positions near the bridge ramp. He was the last to leave each site, ensuring no soldier was left behind. His strategy was simple but effective. Maintain morale, preserve lives wherever possible and continue to resist, even when resistance seemed futile. By midnight, the battalion was a shadow of its former strength. Colonel Frost, severely wounded, was barely conscious. Radios had failed completely. The surviving men were scattered among the ruins, barely holding defensive lines. Still, the umbrella remained a symbol. In the darkest hours, it reminded the soldiers that courage was not the absence of fear, it was the decision to act despite it. The Germans, frustrated by the stubborn resistance, intensified their assaults. Flames engulfed buildings, armor rolled forward with terrifying precision, and infantry attacks surged. Yet Digby led with calm determination. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a myth in the making. Every man under his command understood that as long as he walked through the storm, umbrella in hand, there was hope. Hope that survival was possible, hope that ingenuity could overcome sheer force, hope that even the most impossible battle could be endured with courage and cleverness. The battle for Arnhem Bridge raged on. Death and destruction surrounded them. Yet Major Digby Tatum Wart's umbrella remained raised, not merely as a shield against the rain, but as a beacon of defiance. Against overwhelming odds, the paratroopers were learning a vital lesson. Courage, leadership, and unwavering resolve could make the impossible achievable. And in those streets of fire and ruin, the legend of the umbrella grew one step, one action, one daring decision at a time. By the morning of September 21st, the 2nd Parachute Battalion was effectively destroyed. Arnhem Bridge had become a graveyard of ruined buildings, smoldering vehicles, and exhausted men. The few remaining soldiers were trapped beneath the weight of German encirclement, outnumbered and outgunned. Amid the chaos, Major Digby Tatum Wart remained the last pillar of order. His uniform was torn and blackened, his bowler hat caked with mud, yet he still carried the umbrella, the improbable symbol of hope and defiance. The German forces, recognizing the futility of further frontal attacks, moved to round up the survivors. Smoke choked the streets, making visibility poor and movement treacherous. Digby assessed the situation calmly. There was no plan for counterattack. No reinforcements were coming. The battalion had fought valiantly, but the weight of 2 panzer divisions and relentless infantry had finally sealed their fate. Still, he would not abandon his men. White flags appeared in the streets. The Germans, in an act of pragmatic restraint, allowed the wounded to be evacuated. Digby supervised the movement, ensuring that no soldier was left behind, even under the watchful eyes of armed SS officers. As the survivors were rounded up, the sheer scale of destruction became apparent. Buildings were reduced to skeletal shells. Tanks lay overturned and shattered. Bodies, both friend and foe, littered the cobblestones. And through it all, Digby's umbrella remained intact, its black silk a stark contrast against the devastation. Captured, the major was loaded into a truck alongside other officers and driven to a holding area near Velp. His body ached, bruises and cuts covering him, but his mind was alert. He observed the German guards, studied their routines and noticed the gaps in their vigilance. Unlike most prisoners, Digby did not succumb to despair. He recognized immediately that surrender was not the end of his mission. It was simply a challenge to be overcome. Transported to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, converted into a POW ward, Digby noted the chaos of wounded soldiers, screaming men and distracted guards. His injuries were superficial, but he played the role of a broken, shell-shocked officer perfectly. Slumping his shoulders, dragging his leg, mumbling incoherently, he became part of the background. The German soldiers, overwhelmed by the volume of wounded and desperate patients, paid little attention to the quiet figure in the corner. By afternoon, he had identified an opportunity, an unguarded second-story window that opened onto a small garden. Below, a drain pipe ran down the brick wall, a precarious route to freedom. Timing and patience would be essential. Digby waited until the nurses' backs were turned and a guard distracted by cigarette smoke had drifted away. Then, moving with quiet precision, he slipped through the window frame, grabbing the drain pipe and descending to the garden below. His landing was controlled, almost cat-like. The grass cushioned him and he rolled, remaining low and undetected. Behind him lay the hospital, heavily patrolled. Ahead lay open countryside crawling with enemy patrols, mines and checkpoints. He knew the logical route to Allied lines, south toward Nijmegen, would be watched. Predictable. He needed a plan. He needed to think like a hunter and move like a ghost. 4 days, Digby relied on the cover of night and the natural terrain to survive. He subsisted on stolen apples, raw vegetables, and the occasional forage scrap. He avoided roads, kept to the shadows of forests, and used stars for navigation. Each night, he advanced carefully, always alert to the slightest sound of boots on leaves or the glint of a flashlight through the underbrush. By the third night, hunger and fatigue gnawed at him, but he remained resolute. Eventually he found a light in a farmhouse window. It was a risk. Could the occupants be collaborators? Could he be walking into a trap? Yet survival required courage. He knocked. The farmer's eyes widened at the sight of the dirty, disheveled man in a torn paratrooper smock. Digby used gestures to communicate, pointing to his uniform, then to the woods. After a tense moment, the farmer made a decision. He let him in, fed him, and provided clothing and a false identity. Digby became Peter Jansen, a deaf-mute son of a lawyer from Rotterdam. It was convincing, and it was his ticket to move deeper behind enemy lines. But escape alone was not enough. In the forests surrounding Arnhem, British survivors hid in small groups, too few to resist, too frightened to coordinate. Digby recognized the opportunity to transform despair into action. He cycled between safe houses under the guise of a civilian, organizing men, recovering weapons from abandoned battlefields, and establishing training and communication. From a ragtag group of lost soldiers, he was building a clandestine army. By mid-October, Digby had consolidated 138 men, paratroopers, pilots, engineers, and civilians who had evaded capture. Hidden in the dense Dutch woods near Eid, he established defensive perimeters, improvised training areas, and even simple signals for communication. The Germans were aware of resistance in the area but did not understand the scope or cohesion of the force they were unknowingly facing. To them it was simply a band of scattered fugitives. In reality, it was a disciplined unit under the command of a man who had already turned an umbrella into a weapon against a tank. The psychological impact of Digby's leadership was profound. His men were exhausted, terrified, and low on resources, yet their confidence grew under his guidance. Even the simplest instructions, delivered with calm authority and subtle humor, became orders they followed without hesitation. Fear transformed into determination. Chaos became strategy. Survival became mission. As winter approached, the risk of discovery increased. Leaves fell from the trees, revealing their hidden positions, while German patrols intensified. Yet Digby remained unbroken. He knew that only one successful operation could ensure the survival of his clandestine army, the crossing of the Rhine to rejoin Allied forces. One calculated, daring, and coordinated move could transform them from hunted fugitives into free soldiers. He called it Operation Pegasus, a name that carried hope, audacity, and precision. The stage was set. The men, though ragged and weary, would follow him into the darkness, under the eyes of an enemy who believed them powerless, toward the impossible. By late October 1944, the Dutch forests surrounding Eede were cloaked in early winter chill, the ground softened by rain and frost. Major Digby Tatum Wart surveyed his ragtag army from a concealed ridge. 138 men, British paratroopers, stranded pilots, engineers and Dutch resistance fighters, had been gathered, trained and armed with whatever could be scavenged from abandoned battlefields. Their numbers were small, their weapons limited, but their resolve was immense. Tonight, under his command, they would attempt the impossible, cross the Rhine River and rejoin Allied forces. The operation was meticulously planned. Digby had spent days observing German patrol patterns, noting the frequency of searchlights, the rotations of sentries, and the positions of machine gun nests along the riverbanks. He had identified a stretch of the Rhine where the current was strong but the patrols sporadic. Small canvas boats could ferry them across silently if timed perfectly. Failure meant almost certain death, drowning in the icy waters or capture and execution by the SS. Yet his confidence never wavered. If an umbrella could disable a tank, he reasoned, courage and ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. As darkness fell, the men assembled silently in the clearing. They wore civilian clothing where possible, boots wrapped in rags to muffle footsteps, and faces hidden beneath scarves and hoods. Digby moved among them, checking weapons, adjusting straps and offering quiet words of encouragement. The weight of fear was palpable, yet in the midst of it, a strange calm pervaded. The men trusted him implicitly. If he could lead them through Arnhem under fire, they believed he could lead them across this river. The first obstacle was German patrols that roamed the forest paths leading to the riverbank. Digby signaled for complete silence. Using hand signals, the men slipped through undergrowth and shadows, one by one, like ghosts moving through a haunted forest. Every crunch of leaves underfoot, every snapping twig sent hearts racing, but the group maintained discipline. Any sudden movement could reveal their position. Yet, under Digby's guidance, they reached the river undetected. At the bank, the scene was tense. The Rhine was wide, dark, and fast-flowing. Reflections of distant searchlights shimmered across the surface, and the occasional plumes of smoke from German posts painted fleeting patterns on the water. Digby inspected the small canvas boats arranged along the shore. Each could carry a handful of men, but the operation required absolute precision. Too many in one boat and they risked capsizing. Too few and the mission would drag on until daylight, increasing exposure. He called the men together. "Silence is our armor," he whispered, his voice carrying calm authority. "Darkness is our shield. Follow my lead. No mistakes. No heroics. We move together, we cross together, and we all make it home." The men nodded, gripping makeshift paddles and clutching rifles. In that moment, fear transformed into focus, and the impossible became a tangible objective. The first boats pushed off, slipping silently into the current. Digby waited in last, ensuring every man was aboard before setting off. The current tugged at them relentlessly, each stroke of the paddle a battle against icy water and gravity. In the shadows, the faint silhouettes of German sentries could be seen, but the men remained invisible, hidden beneath the natural cover and darkness. The forest on the far bank was dense, providing just enough concealment for their approach. Midway through the crossing, a patrol flare suddenly lit the sky. Panic threatened to take hold, but Digby maintained his composure. He signaled the boats to press on, guiding them with hand gestures and shouted commands barely above a whisper. The boats swayed dangerously, water splashing over the sides, but the men paddled with synchronized determination. For 20 tense minutes, the crossing continued, each heartbeat echoing the stakes. One misstep, one panicked movement, and all would be lost. On the far side, the first boats reached the riverbank. Digby was the last to disembark, helping men out of the water, reassuring the shivering, exhausted soldiers. Together they moved inland, melting into the forest. The Rhine, a boundary that had seemed insurmountable, was behind them. Ahead lay safety, warmth, and reunion with Allied forces. Yet even in this moment of triumph, Digby knew the operation was not complete until every single man had crossed. There could be no mistakes, no delays. Hours later, as dawn began to tint the sky pale gray, the final group reached the Allied positions. American and Canadian engineers, alerted by a prearranged signal of red-lensed flashlight flashes, had launched small boats from the south bank. They guided the remaining men across, quietly, efficiently, and without alerting German patrols. One by one, the exhausted soldiers stepped onto the southern shore, shaking from cold, adrenaline, and relief. When Digby finally set foot on the south bank, he surveyed his ragged army. 138 men had followed him through enemy territory, evaded capture, and crossed a river that had claimed many before. They were soaked, starving, exhausted, but alive. The mission, Operation Pegasus, was a success. Major Digby Tatum Ward did not celebrate. He simply adjusted his hat, checked his revolver, and surveyed his men. Every one of them owed their survival to his leadership, ingenuity, and unyielding courage. Even now, wet, muddy, and weary, he embodied the paradoxical blend of audacity and calm that had defined his actions at Arnhem, in the hospital, and throughout the forests of Holland. The men were alive because he refused to surrender, refused to panic, and refused to believe in the impossible. And in that quiet, misty dawn, with the Rhine behind them and freedom ahead, it became clear. Courage was contagious, leadership transformative, and the spirit of one man could save the lives of many against overwhelming odds. Digby's umbrella was long gone, left behind in the ruins of Arnhem, yet the legend it symbolized, audacity, fearlessness, and unorthodox courage, had followed him across the river. The soldiers who had survived would tell the story again and again. A man with an umbrella had led them through fire, bullets, and rivers, and against all odds had brought them home. The dawn after Operation Pegasus was unlike any the men had ever witnessed. Mist curled over the riverbanks like ghostly fingers, and the chill of early morning was only partially warmed by the quiet satisfaction of survival. 138 soldiers, ragged, soaked, and exhausted, stood together on Allied soil, a living testament to courage, ingenuity, and perseverance. Major Digby Tatum Ward surveyed the scene with his usual calm composure. There was no celebration, no cheers, only the subtle acknowledgement in the eyes of his men that the impossible had been achieved. For Digby, survival was never the end. The war was still raging across Europe, but for these men, Operation Pegasus represented a triumph over despair. He ensured each soldier was accounted for, organized for medical attention, and provided with food and warmth. He moved among them, offering practical instructions interspersed with quiet humor, a gloved hand on a shoulder, a wry comment about their bedraggled appearance, a smile that reminded them courage and levity could coexist. News of the operation spread quickly through Allied channels. Commanders were astonished at how a scattered, trapped, and besieged battalion had not only survived but had done so under the guidance of a single officer. For the men themselves, the legend of the umbrella had transformed from anecdote to symbol. Though the silk and wood instrument that had first inspired them had been lost in the ruins of Arnhem, the idea it represented endured: audacity, leadership, and the defiance of conventional wisdom. After the war, Digby Tatum Ward faded into a quieter life. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his extraordinary leadership, bravery, and ingenuity at Arnhem. Yet the accolades did not define him. He moved to Kenya, purchasing a modest farm far from the noise of battlefields and the memories of gunfire and mortars. His days were filled with tending crops, raising livestock, and cultivating a peaceful existence. Still, those who knew him noted the spark in his eye, the same glint that had allowed him to disable a German tank with a 14-ounce umbrella and lead hundreds of men through impossible circumstances. Hollywood eventually sought him out. The filmmakers of A Bridge Too Far wanted historical accuracy, and Digby was brought in as a technical consultant. He walked actors and directors through the streets of Arnhem, explaining strategies, troop movements, and the chaos of urban combat. He told them about the bridges, the tanks, and the desperate improvisation that had defined those days. And, inevitably, he told them about the umbrella. The reaction was predictable. The producers, fearing disbelief from a modern audience, replaced the umbrella with a simple walking stick for the character based on Digby. To them, reality was too audacious, too surreal, and too cinematic to be true. Yet for those who had witnessed the events firsthand, and for those who had studied them in the aftermath, Digby's umbrella remained an enduring symbol, not of a weapon but of spirit, creativity, and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. Stories of Digby Tatum Ward became the stuff of legend. In military circles, his leadership at Arnhem and his orchestration of Operation Pegasus were studied as examples of resourcefulness, psychological insight, and the profound impact of morale on survival. Soldiers were taught that fear was a constant, but courage could be cultivated. Innovation could turn the simplest object into a tool of survival. And one man's audacity could change the course of history for many. Years passed. Digby lived quietly, never seeking recognition or accolades beyond what was officially awarded. He rarely spoke of the battles, the deaths, or the horrors he had witnessed. But friends and family would occasionally notice his subtle reminders of the past. a carefully folded piece of black silk tucked into a drawer, a small bowler hat placed beside a window to catch sunlight, or a story told in jest about the absurdity of a soldier walking into the teeth of a German tank armed only with an umbrella. Digby died in 1993 at the age of 75. His funeral was modest, attended by family, friends, and a handful of veterans who had survived Arnhem and Operation Pegasus. Those who knew him spoke not just of his bravery but of his character. His ability to inspire, to lead, and to remain calm in the most impossible situations. The umbrella, the object that had first symbolized courage, had long since disappeared, but its legend endured in stories, memoirs, and military histories. In the broader sweep of history, Digby's tale is a reminder that courage does not always come from superior firepower, meticulous planning, or overwhelming numbers. Sometimes it comes from audacity, calmness under pressure, and the willingness to confront the impossible with creativity and resolve. The umbrella that had once seemed a trivial or absurd accessory became, in retrospect, an emblem of unshakable human spirit. For the soldiers he saved, the men who survived against impossible odds, and the countless readers and historians who later discovered his story, Digby Tatum Ward became more than a soldier. He became a symbol. A living lesson that in the darkest, most desperate moments, humor, ingenuity, and courage could coexist. That fear, no matter how real or consuming, could be challenged. That the improbable, if faced with audacity and determination, could be achieved. And in this, the legend of the umbrella lives on, not as a weapon, not as a gimmick, but as a testament to human resilience. Major Digby Tatum Ward, the man who had once faced panzer divisions with a bowler hat and a 14-ounce piece of silk and wood, showed the world that even in war, style, humor, and courage could redefine the possible. The story ends not with gunfire or explosions, but with quiet reflection. A man walked through the storm, held an umbrella high, led his men across impossible odds, and survived. History remembers him not just for what he did but for the spirit he embodied. A spirit that reminds us, in life and in war, to face the storm, to act with courage, and sometimes to simply open the umbrella and keep walking.